Moses and Will, you got a portion about clothing. What do you do with a Torah portion about clothing? Well, you went with weight. The heaviness of the priestly garments as a reminder of the responsibility of leadership. The ways that some leaders fail to live up to that responsibility. The ways that we can demand that they do. I love what you're doing around environmental racism, and I love your call to action to all of us to hold our leaders accountable, to ring the bell as if they had the bell on the hem of their robe. Moses, you were fascinated by the question of external authority. The idea that the Israelites and the priests used their garments to turn to God for decision-making instead of making their own choices. Comparing that to the pressure some might feel to wear a kippah or a talit while in synagogue, and even more broadly, the ways that we might dress to fit in or gain approval instead of expressing ourselves freely through our attire. First, a clarification. No one at CBE has to wear a kippah or a talit ever. Freedom of religious expression or abstention from religious expression is extremely important and a central value here. No one ever has to do, say, or wear anything that doesn't feel right to them while in this sanctuary. And we at CBE are kind of known for people wearing any clothes they want, from formal wear to shorts or jeans. But sometimes dressing up can feel like a burden, but sometimes it can elevate us. And sometimes choosing, like I'm someone who often chooses to wear a kippah, sometimes it can lift us out of the ordinary, which is also what Shabbat is meant to do. That's not what I'm going to talk about. A Hasidic teacher known as Meor Einayim, Rabbi Menachem of Chernobyl, imagines the priestly clothing as a parallel to God's act of clothing God's self. He draws upon the Kabbalistic tradition that God is the Ein Sof, the limitless, the infinite. And when God wanted to create the world, God found that the finite world couldn't hold God's infinite nature. So God had to shrink God's self, it's called tzimtzum, in order to create the world. The first step was to transform into light. Even light was a constriction for God. Yet, it was too much for the world to bear. The world couldn't hold that intensity of light, and world after world shattered. So God garbed God's self in Torah. Torah became God's clothing. And the letters of the Torah became the building blocks for the world. But to make the Torah something that human beings could relate to or understand, God had to endure many layers of limitation, becoming more and more constricted, concrete, bounded, dense, until the language could make sense to people, and specifically to the generation of the Torah, speaking in their idiom, in their worldview, in images and concepts that they could comprehend. Now, our Torah portion does not begin with clothing this week. It actually begins with the Ner Tamid, the eternal light, the light that burned in the tabernacle and that we find in every synagogue. אתה תצווה את בני ישראל ויקחו אליך שמן זית זך כתית למאור להעלות נר תמיד. And you shall instruct the Israelites to bring you clear oil of beaten olives for lighting, for kindling a ner tamid, an eternal light. What we must do when we encounter Torah, Meor Einayim says, is beat it like the Israelites were commanded to beat the olives, so that its solidified, concretized, coarsened form can become pure again and ultimately can become light. When you see something in Torah that feels limited, well, it might be because it is. We're supposed to struggle with Torah, beating and pressing the words and phrases and ideas until light emerges, something that gives us a glimpse of the infinite. That process is called dat, awareness. And Meor Einayim teaches that God's wisdom, chokhmah, is a light hidden deep within and can only be seen when we use dat, awareness, to beat and press the forms of the text that limit it and that limit us. That's what we do when we write a Devar Torah. That's what each of you did. We massage the text again and again until some hidden light shines through. I think of all of the layers of clothing that the priest was under, and how behind that breastplate and that ephod and that robe and those stones and those bells was a human being, a real person, Not just a leader or a figurehead, a person with fears and wants, longings and disappointments. That clothing could be a shield to avoid responsibility, as you taught us, Will. It could also be a shield to hide behind, like you taught us, Moses. We sometimes hide in garments that show the world what we think it wants to see, instead of what's really inside. And sometimes we hide our light, our brightest, truest self, our best ideas or creations, or aspects of our being that we think might be too intense, or raw, or uncool, or embarrassing. Sometimes we worry that our inside reality is too much for others to handle, in the way that God was too much for the world to handle. We fear that if people knew or saw what we were really like, our sorrow, our loneliness, our anger, our insecurity, our weaknesses, our longings, our meltdowns, we would be too much for the world. But we are not God. The world can hold all of our being and all of our light. You might be able to tell I've been reading a lot of Brene Brown recently. And I know I'm late to this party. As probably everybody knows, maybe a lot of people know, that she talks about vulnerability, which essentially is taking down our armor, taking down all those layers of limiting garb, and showing each other how we really feel, admitting mistakes, sharing ideas and creations that feel precious to us, and therefore risky. Knowing that people might criticize us, might knock us down for it, risking it anyway. Letting ourselves be a bit exposed, with boundaries, where it's appropriate, when it's mutual. Her research shows that people are drawn to others when they are vulnerable. When they share their emotions and tell their truths, we recognize the courage in it. And we instinctively know that when one person is vulnerable, it creates greater safety for everyone else. Just a little more room to be open, to be real. But when it's our turn to be vulnerable, most of us instinctively hide behind our garments of one kind or another. We're afraid of people seeing the unpolished version of us, uncurated, unguarded. A lot of us have shame about things we really don't have to be ashamed of. Shame comes from our evolution as a social species to protect us from exclusion. It's the voice that tells us that something about us is wrong or inadequate, should be hidden, or else we'll be rejected. But often it's not true. And often the hiding is much worse than the exposure would be. Just as we must press on the hardened, limiting layers of the Torah to find the pure light within, this is a good week, in Parshat Tetzaveh, to ask ourselves, how are we shielded, buffered, garbed in limiting layers, to protect others from our full light, to protect ourselves from exposure? How do we hide? What creations, ideas, truths do we secretly wish we could share with the world if only we knew it would be accepted, if only we knew that it would be safe? In addition to all of the clothing we've spoken about, the high priest had a headdress with the words, Kadosh L'Adonai, holy to God, on his forehead. My rabbinical school teacher of blessed memory, Rabbi Richard Levy, taught us to walk through the world seeing those words on the forehead of every human being we met. May we find the courage to beat down the shielding garb, to show ourselves, trusting that our hidden shames are actually our light, that we are good enough, blemishes and all, holy to God even, and worthy of acceptance and love for who and how we are. Shabbat Shalom.